yours. There's a delay. Listen to myself, but the good thing is now we actually have sound. Last time we put one of these on, it showed the video but not the sound of the presenter.
Oh no.
So now hopefully we've got the sound. Although what I am going to do, let me have you move over here so I'm not going to blast you with this, because I do want to make sure we're...
This is good enough?
Yeah, I'll try and get this turned down, but I want to make sure the microphone on the camera picks this up. Well, welcome to territory of the most desolate nature. I'm John Woodward, the Director of Museums for the Wyoming Military Department, and our program tonight is going to cover Wyoming and the 1919 Transcontinental Motor Convoy. This was probably one of the more important military ventures after World War I, but one of the few that's very, very little understood. And it's right at the dawn of the motor age. So, first thing, we talk about putting horses out to pasture. The auto industry was coming to dominate the industrial landscape right after the Great War. By 1919, there was an estimated 6.5 million cars in the United States. Detroit steel was quickly becoming known well across the country with companies like Ford, General Motors, Chevrolet, and Packard. Other cities in the industrial belt like Akron, Ohio, were churning out tires by the plenty through companies like Goodyear, Goodrich, and Firestone, which, with the exception of Packard, are all available today. Despite the boom in ownership, there were a few places where auto enthusiasts feared to take their cars. The first cross-country auto trip was in 1903. Two men, Horatio Jackson and Sewell Crocker, Crocker was a mechanic, took a 65-day trip from San Francisco to New York City. While in Idaho, they picked up a stray bulldog named Bud, who accompanied the rest of the way. This trip really touched off a wave of cross-country drives promoted by business and auto industry enthusiasts. This springboard helped to inspire a generation of people to see the car and not just the train as a means for cross-country transportation, and also for fun. They helped inspire a series of roads or road networks that came to dominate the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Probably the most famous is the Lincoln Highway. It was arguably the first transcontinental highway in the United States. It was a network versus a single highway. The proponents connected existing roadways together to make one coast-to-coast path. So this map is a lot more streamlined than the actual route. It was the product of the Lincoln Highway Association, a nonprofit corporation that was promoted and organized to further automotive travel. Its first president was Henry Joy, the president of the Packard Motor Car Company. And the vice president and sort of visionary behind the Lincoln Highway was a gentleman named Carl Fisher. Fisher, in 1912, had created the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and is very famous for being the one who actually paved the speedway in bricks. So he is the father of the Brickyard, and also the Indianapolis 500. The 3,389-mile route of the Lincoln Highway opened to the public in 1913. It began at Times Square in New York City and ended in Lincoln Park in San Francisco. The route crossed 14 different states, including Wyoming. The Lincoln Highway was committed to assisting travelers during their treks across the highway. These included the publication of annual travel guides that provided a wealth of information for travelers, as well as contact information for local highway consoles. These consoles would be located in different communities across the route, and they would serve as a point of contact for travelers to provide assistance, and also to point out different tourist attractions in that particular area. The Lincoln Highway Association also saw the installation of directional signage. The cement markers along the Lincoln Highway route with red, white, and blue with a big capital L are commonplace from the Lincoln Highway Association. They would occasionally also pay for small segments of paved or improved roads. These seedling miles were paid for with proceeds from memberships and corporate sponsorships as a way to encourage local governments to pave and improve their roads. This was the era of the Good Roads movement, which was both a civic and governmental push to improve America's roadways. The Lincoln Highway still exists today. It was largely renumbered in the 1920s as US Highway 30, and with the advent of the interstate system, most of it became Interstate 80 today. Another road association that crossed Wyoming in a very small way was the Yellowstone Trail. The Yellowstone Trail is one of the arguably even older than the Lincoln Highway Association. It was conceived by Joseph Parmalee in Ipswich, South Dakota in 1912 and formally incorporated in 1918. The Yellowstone Trail connected Plymouth, Massachusetts with Puget Sound and went across the northern tier of the United States. The founders, to tie in with the popularity of Yellowstone National Park, made a quick tie-in to the park through the North Gate, the Roosevelt Gate in northern Montana. So one could argue that it did come into a very small part of Wyoming as it crossed into the park. The Yellowstone Trail covered 3,719 miles and crossed 13 different states. Like the Lincoln Highway Association, it also had road associates that would help travelers. It had state and also local chapters that worked to further road efforts both at a state level and then on the local level. The Yellowstone Trail Association closed in 1930 as the Depression put a block on leisure travel in the United States. The final highway that I'll talk about before we get into a little bit more about the Good Roads movement is the Black and Yellow Highway. Now, it was an early competitor to the Yellowstone Highway. Both used a very similar color scheme. However, the Black and Yellow crossed from Chicago to Yellowstone National Park, moving largely through South Dakota and into Wyoming. The association, like many others, was first set up in 1912, but didn't set up a route until the following year. The Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming proved to be the largest obstacle to the Black and Yellow Highway because up until about 1915, there wasn't a reliable road across the Bighorns into the Bighorn Basin. Road construction began in 1915 and wasn't completed until about 2 years later. As with all of these road associations, their routes would change a little bit throughout their history. The Black and Yellow, for example, is largely would follow Interstate 90 from the South Dakota line to Gillette, and then from Gillette would take US 1416 to Ucross, and then would take US 16 from Ucross to Buffalo, and then 16 across Powder River Pass into the Bighorn Basin. So these are a couple of the routes that were popularly known right before the First World War. Now, it is important to know that up until right before the First World War, there was not a lot of public funds going into highway construction. The Good Roads movement was a civic and political organization or alliance of different groups committed to improving America's road network. Up until this point, it's largely the railroads dominating cross-country travel. So if you could think of a railroad town serving as sort of the hub for a series of market roads, and the whole point of those roads is to get goods in and out of that railroad center. there weren't many connections between roads from across the country. So the Good Roads movement sought to increase and improve these roads to make them more navigable for automobiles and trucks, with the idea of eventually establishing either a transcontinental highway or a series of commercial roads that would help speed up commercial development. In 1916, this movement really bore fruit at the federal level. Missouri Representative Dorsey Shackelford of Boonville proposed the Federal Aid Road Act of 1916. This was the first federal act to actually bring money into state coffers for road construction. It was promoted by the American Association of State Highway Officials, which is still in existence today. The legislation passed, and in due part to the assistance of Alabama Senator John Bankhead. The bill appropriated $75 million for road projects over a 5-year period. Very familiar, it had states would have to put some skin in the game, promoting a 1-to-1 match, as well as creating a state agency to oversee that work. Their goal with this bill was to construct or improve about 6% of roads in the United States over a 5-year period. Interestingly enough, the Department of Agriculture was responsible for administering this grant, as the U.S. Department of Transportation wouldn't be established until the late 1960s. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, supported the Good Roads movement and signed this bill into law on July 11th, 1916. However, with the involvement in the First World War and some issues with the bill, it really wasn't as effective as its authors had hoped, and it took some time into the 1920s for additional legislation to iron some of that out. However, Wyoming did jump at the chance to get some of those highway funds. So in 1917, the Wyoming legislature took up the task of creating a highway department. Now, there were several different competing bills for this. Ultimately, a committee bill championed by Weston County Representative C.P. Meek got across the finish line and was signed into law. It's kind of interesting to talk about the Wyoming Highway Department in its early days, because it was really a seasonal agency. Today we think of YDOT plowing the roads throughout the winter and being active throughout the different projects. However, the Highway Department in its very early years was only sort of a summertime agency, and would lay off most of its workers during the winter because snow removal was not a priority. Road construction and maintenance was. So let's talk more about the 1919 Convoy. So the War Department and Army leadership had 4 primary objectives for the convoy, along with an unstated 5th objective. Most of these centered around public relations and outreach. However, there were several additional priorities attached. First, the convoy was to test the latest vehicles for endurance against difficult terrain. It's very important that a lot of these vehicles we think of vehicles as very robust, but these had maybe 3 or 4 decades worth of mechanical technologies that they were working with. The second objective was to create a detailed study of terrain and equipment. So the goal for this was, how would these vehicles work in a cross-country environment? A lot of Army leaders weren't quite sure how, say, a truck would be able to go in maybe boggy conditions. Would vehicles be able to work and be used in a combat environment if they had to go cross-country? The third was to aid in recruiting efforts. This was right after the Great War. Most of the volunteer Army of the United States had been demobilized at this point, and so they wanted to be able to recruit young men to be able to use these vehicles. So very similar to how, Army and Army National Guard recruiters work today, bringing out vehicles and showing them off to recruits. They did the exact same thing in 1919. And there was a recruiting officer attached to the convoy to help recruit new people. Fourthly, this was to serve as the Army's contribution to the Good Roads movement, to help show faith in the Lincoln Highway and other road networks, and to help inspire leaders to go ahead and invest in improving the road network. Then the final reason, and then the unstated reason, was to demonstrate to the American people the types of vehicles and equipment that had helped win the World War. Many of these people, especially in rural areas, wouldn't necessarily be acquainted with vehicles, trucks, cars. That would be something that they might see on occasion in one of the larger communities. But in a lot of the small rural areas, it was still very much a horse and buggy society. So they wanted to show off these vehicles and show off the investment that Americans had paid in things like Liberty bonds and other items. So those were the 5 reasons for why they drove. Now let's talk about the men who went. So the convoy itself was a mix of Army and civilian personnel. In terms of the Army personnel, the leader of the expedition was Colonel Charles W. McClure. McClure was a long-standing veteran, had served in the First World War, and this would serve as his final assignment before retirement. Under his command were about 20 officers and 258 enlisted personnel. They also included there was an additional 17 observers attached to the expedition that were outside of McClure's direct chain of command. Most of the soldiers on the convoy belonged to the 433rd Motor Supply Train. That was a part of the Army's motor transit service that had just been started. And the other bulk of the troops came from the Service Park Unit number 595. So with the 433rd, that was the soldiers that were driving most of the vehicles, with the Service Park Unit serving as the mechanics to keep the vehicles operational. Along with the convoy was a company from the 5th Engineers Regiment to help build and repair any bridges and roadways and culverts that they might encounter, and they encountered a lot. Along with detachments from the Army Medical Corps and the Field Artillery. The artillery, this might seem like a strange addition, however, they sent along probably one of the most useful vehicles in the arsenal at that time, the Militor. And we'll talk a little bit about the Militor and how it saved the expedition on numerous occasions. The observers really did not have any specific responsibilities on the convoy itself. Their responsibility was to observe the operations of the vehicles, the operations of the convoy, and then report back to their various branches of service, whether that was the Air Corps or the Field Artillery, the Tank Corps, the Ordnance Department, about how vehicles could be utilized in their particular parts of the Army. In addition to the military component, there were civilians that went along with the convoy itself. The most visible was a gentleman you can see on the screen here, Mr. Henry Osterman, who had the title of Field Secretary for the Lincoln Highway Association. This was Mr. Osterman's 19th transit of the United States along the Lincoln Highway, and his official role in the expedition was to serve as the guide. Much like Jim Bridger was guiding military expeditions in the 19th century, Mr. Osterman was guiding the Lincoln Highway, or the convoy along the Lincoln Highway. Additionally, there were also trucks from the Goodyear Rubber Company and also Firestone that accompanied the convoy as well. Mr. Osterman was probably the most visible in his very, well, at least at the beginning, white and shiny Packard touring car, which was often towards the front of the convoy itself. Now, speaking of the convoy, let's talk a little bit about the vehicles. The convoy used a wide range of motorized vehicles, 81 in total. These include 46 trucks, including everything from small Dodge 3/4-ton delivery vans to 5-ton Mack trucks that use a chain drive versus the standard, what they use today. They mostly had cargo trucks, they would hold the convoy supplies, along with 3 tankers that carried both 2 that carried fuel and a 3rd that carried water. And that water tanker was very handy, especially as they got into the Great Divide west of Salt Lake City. The convoy also had 8 passenger cars for officers and observers. These included whites, Cadillacs, and Dodges. The convoy also included 9 motorcycles, including Harley Davidsons and Indians. They served as scouts for the convoy, often going out ahead several miles. The convoy, especially thanks to the medical corps, had 5 ambulances and an assortment of different trailers. Some were cooking, some were storage. It was all sorts of different things. The most important one was the Militor. Now, the Militor is this vehicle right here at the head of this line. It was a custom-built salvage vehicle. It had cost the Army about $40,000 to construct in 1917 dollars, roughly $700,000 if you count it today. It came equipped with a very powerful winch, and thanks to the Militor, many vehicles were able to be pulled out of the mud, especially in Nebraska, and kept on the road because of that vehicle. At different times, it could tow up to 4 or 5 different vehicles at a time if they broke down. So the Militor was the priceless vehicle that soldiers shed tears when it broke down west of Salt Lake City and couldn't continue with them. So what's really important or really interesting about this convoy is one of the men who was an observer, and that was Lieutenant Colonel Dwight Eisenhower. At this time, he was a 28-year-old man. He had married Mamie by this point, and their son was 3 years old. He was one of 17 observers that were assigned to this convoy. A Texas native, he grew up in Abilene, Kansas. Had received an appointment to West Point in 1911 and graduated in 1915. The 1915 class is commonly referred to as the class the stars fell on, since 59 of its members would become general officers. One of his classmates was Omar Bradley, so both he and Bradley became 5-star generals at the end of the Second World War. But he also was classmates with James Van Fleet and Joseph McNary. So Eisenhower had graduated in 1915, and within 4 years he'd already been promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel, which was phenomenal for that period of time, and even today. However, unlike many of his peers, he did not actually see European service during World War I. He was assigned to Camp Colt near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he was helping to develop and train the fledgling Tank Corps. According to my sources, by the end of World War I, the Tank Corps camp at Camp Colt only had 3 tanks, possibly 5, but not enough to train enough for the Army. By 1919, he was actually considering leaving military service and had been offered a position in civilian life and was seriously considering it when this particular activity came up. The Tank Corps asked for 2 volunteers, so he and his friend, Major Sereno Brett, jumped at the chance for a little adventure, and they took on the role of the observers of the Tank Corps for this expedition. And they had a little bit of fun along the way. So the convoy began at Camp Meigs, Washington, and began to gather in early July. What's interesting to note is that Camp Meigs shares the name with the same ship that actually took the Wyoming National Guard to Korea several decades later. It's named after the same person. But it was located in northeast Washington, D.C., near the campus of Gallaudet University, which is a historic university for the hearing impaired. But that site had been in service since the Civil War and would close the following year. On July 7th, the convoy mounted up and left Camp Meigs for the ellipse, which is right in front of the White House. At 8:30 in the morning, the National Highway Association dedicated Milestone Zero. That's the ceremony you can see at the bottom of the screen, that included a number of dignitaries presiding, including Secretary of War Newton Baker, who was standing in for the president. Also present at that ceremony was Army Chief of Staff Peyton C. Marsh, a mess of general officers, and a number of members of Congress. With a formal order from Secretary Baker, the convoy departed on their westward journey. They encountered their first mechanical difficulties only a few miles down the road in Rockville, Maryland, as they stopped for lunch. These particular difficulties included a broken magneto coupling and a broken fan belt. Broken fan belts were very common throughout the entire convoy. But on their first day, they managed to cover 46 miles in 7¼ hours, camping at the Frederick, Maryland Fairgrounds. So let's talk about how the convoy moved as a formation. It was very spread out, just to be honest, with some elements a few days ahead of the main body. The convoy's publicity officer, Lieutenant William Doran, was often 2 or 3 days ahead of the main column. Now, he was going ahead to be able to not only coordinate with local officials, but also to let the local news media know that the convoy was on its way and they needed to be ready. He would often be followed a day or so behind by Captain James Murphy, the recruiting officer. Within the convoy itself, typically the mess trucks and trailers took the lead, and they would often leapfrog the formation so they could have lunch or dinner set up when the main body of the convoy arrived. Also, ahead of the main formation were several scouts, usually riding motorcycles, and they would usually be about 1 hour or 2 hours ahead of the main body. Their role was to scout the route, place directional markers, and then examine roads and bridges that needed to be repaired. The main body itself was led by the group from the 5th Engineers. They very often had to repair, reinforce, or rebuild bridges and culverts around the route. In Wyoming alone, they had to rebuild 16 bridges and had to repair countless others. Otherwise, they might lose trucks along the way. The main body, following the engineers, included the staff observers. Soldiers from the service park unit brought up the end of the column. They repaired any vehicles that would have broken down during the day, sometimes working into the night to get vehicles operational to join the rest of the convoy. Discipline was a major issue reported by Eisenhower in his report and by Lieutenant Jackson, who was part of the Ordnance Department. Most of the convoy soldiers were brand new to the uniform and also were very, very, very junior drivers. So there was a lot of accidents due to inexperience, and there was discipline problems, especially since the formation really hadn't been able to exercise as a group before setting out. But at least the driving experience would be solved by the end after about 3,000 miles worth of practice. The convoy itself kept up communications throughout, with the exception of parts of Nevada and Utah, via telephone and telegraph. Lieutenant Jackson from the Ordnance Department sent regular telegrams with updates on the convoy, and there were regular reports, daily reports going from Colonel McClure back to the War Department. But once they got past Salt Lake City, there really wasn't any kind of communications out of the desert. So let's talk about the easy east. The first few days of the convoy, they found really fast, quick movements across Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. By the time they had arrived in Delphos, Ohio, they had traveled 527 miles with the snail's pace of 5.8 miles per hour average speed. Calculating it, I think their average throughout the entire trek was somewhere around 2.6 miles per hour. This was not fast by any means. Each day on the road came with different challenges, including different mechanical problems for the technical personnel to sort out. For the convoy personnel, the Militor tractor became the most important recovery vehicle, usually towing something almost every day. Lieutenant Jackson singles it out in his report, stating, "Hardly a day passed without the Militor doing some towing, and has as many as 9 trucks have been chained together behind the vehicle for tow." This was a powerful, powerful vehicle. The convoy was met warmly throughout communities along the route. The official day-to-day record records factory whistles and church bells being sounded as the convoy arrived in East Palestine, Ohio on July 12th. The following day, the 13th, the convoy, specifically the officers, along with the observers, visited the Columbiana, Ohio homestead of Mr. Harvey S. Firestone. There they were treated to a fine chicken dinner and mingled with a crowd of over 400 guests. Both Jackson and Eisenhower praised the roads throughout the eastern United States up through Illinois or so. Most of these roadways had been paved or made from crushed stone, which is commonly called at this point macadam. Eisenhower notes that they encountered their first dirt roads in Illinois and wouldn't see anything quite like that until they reached California. Both officers agreed that the roads in Iowa would have been a nightmare if there had been any rain. The mud, they estimated, would have been paralyzing. Thankfully, it had been unseasonably dry for several weeks. Looking at climate records, it's recognized as an El Nino year. So if it hadn't been for El Nino, they might not have made it out of Iowa. But here's some pictures from the Firestone feast. In the picture with the house, that is the Firestone homestead. And I believe the gentleman in the first row here in the white suit is Mr. Firestone himself. Then you can see Firestone shaking hands with several Army officers, and a picture of Eisenhower, Harvey Firestone Jr., and Major Sereno Brett at underneath the tent enjoying the chicken dinner. Continuing their trek eastward, the convoy arrived at Chicago Heights, basically south side of Chicago, on July 20th. The convoy spent a rest day in Chicago, where the camp was visited by citizens and dignitaries from across the Chicago area. The daily log for the 20th notes that Sergeant First Class T.E. Wood entertained some of the visitors with a few demonstration stunts with the Militor. The camp was also visited by a newsreel crew, and there are motion pictures of the convoy at different points along the trail. When the convoy left the following day on the 24th, it shot straight across the plains of western Illinois and Iowa. They crossed the Mississippi River the following day at Clinton, Iowa, crossing at the Lyons-Fulton Bridge, which existed up into the 1960s. It reached Denison, Iowa, for another rest day on the 26th. While in Denison, the locals challenged the soldiers to a baseball game. The Daily Report sadly notes the convoy lost the game 15-1. As the convoy began making its way to the Missouri River on the 27th, it again began to encounter these dry Iowa roads. After almost 10 hours and 72 miles, the convoy reached Council Bluffs, Iowa. The following morning, they crossed the Missouri River and entered Omaha over the Douglas Street Bridge, which would later be known as the Ak-Sar-Ben Bridge. Ak-Sar-Ben is Nebraska still spelled backwards. Their arrival was noted in part by Lieutenant Colonel Woost, the commanding officer of Fort Omaha, who had taken a balloon aloft to observe the convoy crossing the bridge and coming into Omaha proper. It stopped in Omaha for the day, continuing west on July 30th. The Platte Valley was the convoy's first significant challenge. The roads west of Columbus, Nebraska began to get increasingly sandy. Convoy personnel had a very warm reception in Grand Island, including a dance hosted by the community. The following day, on August 1st, they drove to Lexington, Nebraska. Then the rain began to fall, and as the convoy moved towards Cozad and Gothenburg, things got worse. Cozad lies on the 100th meridian. Now, the 100th meridian is an arbitrary line that, west of that particular line, the area is less sparsely populated, and agriculture relies heavily on irrigation. So, east of the 100th, it's more populous. Most of the population of the United States lives east of the 100th meridian, and doesn't have to rely on irrigation. But in this case, they found themselves stuck in the Dawson County gumbo mud, and which brought the convoy to a virtual standstill. Their trip between Lexington and Gothenburg, which was only 30 miles, took them 10.5 hours to complete. The following day wasn't much better. Although no rain, the quicksand bogged down the convoy on its road to North Platte, where they made 34 miles in 9.75 hours. As the convoy crawled into North Platte on August 3rd, the convoy leadership decided to take an extra rest day to repair equipment and troop morale. They continued traveling on August 5th, and the convoy made better time as they passed through Ogallala, Big Springs, and Kimball. They crossed the Wyoming line and found fresh quarters waiting for them at Fort David A. Russell on August 8th. So here's some images of the convoy passing through parts of Nebraska, which I can tell you from looking at historical photos of Nebraska, it's pretty desolate country at that part of time. So on August 8th, they arrived in the Magic City. Cheyenne was buzzing with activity, getting ready for the convoy to arrive. Several days earlier, on August 4th, the Cheyenne state leader reported that Governor Robert E. Carey, Cheyenne Mayor E.W. Stone, and Brigadier General O'Neill from Fort Russell were part of the planning and organizing committee for the welcoming the convoy. The group met Colonel McClure and the convoy at Hillsdale, which is east of Cheyenne, that afternoon on the 8th. Troopers from G Company, 15th Cavalry, escorted them into Cheyenne, moving along Lincoln Way and up Capitol Avenue towards Frontier Park, where they arrived at 5:30. Crowds lined the streets as they passed, and that night, the soldiers from the convoy were treated to a miniature Frontier Days rodeo, organized by C.B. Irwin, Charlie Hersig, William Du Bois, and R.B. Davidson. Included horse races, bulldogging, roping, and a saddle bronc competition. That night, they parked at Fort Russell, where the soldiers found baths, fresh quarters, and hot meals waiting for them. After a quick night's sleep, they left for the road to Laramie at 7:45 the next morning. So on August 9th, they are on their way over Sherman Hill, moving across the Laramie Range west to Laramie. They drove 57 miles that day, clocking in 11.5 hours, arriving in Laramie at 7:20 p.m. Sherman Hill, near the old town site and the Ames Monument, was their destination for lunch. The Daily Record notes that the men could spot Pikes Peak about 175 miles away during their lunch stop. After crossing the Continental Divide that afternoon, they did have a small mishap when one of the Mack trucks broke through a small bridge. This would be repeated time and time again over the next few weeks and months. And thanks for the Army engineers to repair those before leaving Wyoming. That night they camped at the Albany County Fairgrounds east of Laramie. The following day was considered a rest day, where the soldiers completed small repairs and prepared the vehicles, including the Militor, for the journey west. On August 11th, they left heading northeast towards Medicine Bow. The convoy left Laramie at 6:30 that morning and headed northeast. The engineers had a busy day along the route, where they had to repair and reinforce 12 bridges that day. Thankfully, as noted by the Daily Log, the Wyoming Highway Department supplied the lumber for the engineers. A Red Cross canteen service served lunch for the group at Rock River, about 36 miles northwest of Laramie. Dust was the other major problem that kept the convoy's mechanics busy, as it kept giving the truck's carburetors fits and starts all day. At 6:15, the convoy arrived in Medicine Bow and found a campsite south of the town. Dinner that night was at the Virginian Hotel, with locals cooking the soldiers a barbecue dinner. Colonel McClure fondly remembered that dinner, since they found it waiting as they were coming into town late. After dinner, the locals put on a street dance, which he noted was a novelty for many of the soldiers. And then as they turned in for the night. The following morning, they would leave and make tracks for Rollins. Only a few miles out of town, one of the trucks broke through a culvert and had to be pulled out by the Militor. Later in the day, they encountered soft roads that needed portable corduroy segments to help bridge and get the vehicles across. On August 12th, they again, the Army engineers had to reinforce and repair another 12 bridges. One of the officers, Lieutenant Casey Downing, actually crushed his finger during the work, although it doesn't note if he had to have it amputated or not. The famous Wyoming winds also provided the column with some company, bringing a 40-mile-an-hour gale down upon them during this particular day. A delegation from Rollins met the column at the site of Old Fort Fred Steele, about 17 miles east of Rollins. The delegation included Rollins Mayor Perrette and coffee and donuts, carefully provided by the citizens of Rollins. They took time to eat at the old fort site before continuing into town. Dinner that night was courtesy of some Saratoga fishermen who had been catching trout and had sent them along on the railroad for the soldiers to enjoy. Afterwards, the town hosted a dance at the local Elks Lodge with music provided by the Goodyear Rubber Company, who had included a band in their convoy truck. The following day, they began crossing the Red Desert. The convoy left Rollins at about 6:15 in the morning and ended up having to make a 22-mile detour after coming across a questionably looking bridge. By the end of the day, their engineers had reinforced 7 additional bridges for the convoy to pass. Almost every truck went through the decking of one of them, one or more that they had crossed. And in one case, one of the Class B trucks actually ran off the road and rolled, although the soldiers on board didn't suffer any injuries. That night, the convoy camped at Tipton Station, a railroad station along the UP that didn't have any civilians other than the railroad workers who were assigned that. It was 16 miles from the nearest natural water source and had the interesting notoriety of being the location of a train stick-up by Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch in 1900. But beyond that, there wasn't much there, and there still isn't much in the Tipton area. Moving on the 14th, they continued their trek across to Green River. They found the Red Desert miserable and dry. The daily report notes that the intensely dry air, absence of trees and green vegetation, and parched appearance of the landscape exerted depressing influence on personnel. The convoy stopped at the old Point of Rocks stage stop, seen in this picture, before continuing on to Green River. They arrived in Green River at 8:15 that night, but despite the late hour, many from Green River and the nearby Rock Springs waited in Union Pacific Park to see them come. The Goodyear Rubber Company band had set up earlier that day and provided music for the assembled crowd as they waited. Next, the following day, on August 15th, they started towards Old Fort Bridger. They left Green River at 6:30 in the morning, which Colonel McClure noted in his personal record had some very, very pretty scenery. He noted the green, buff, and pink tinted stratified rock and wondrous formations and beauty. However, the picturesque landscape soon was in their rearview mirror, and they had a hard day's travel ahead of them. The convoy spent 17 hours on the road that day to cover the 63-mile route to Fort Bridger. The roads and bridges in this part of the state were in a horrible condition. McClure noted fixing 12 bridges before the end of the day. One particular Mack truck on the convoy had several near misses. Just before lunch, just past Granger, Mack truck number 51481 had a rear wheel break through the decking of a small bridge. After lunch, it had problems on the metal bridge over the Blacks Fork near Lyman. Both of the truck's rear wheels broke through the decking in that case. The Army had to carefully unload the truck, and the engineers had to get it off the bridge so they could repair the decking to allow the rest of the convoy to pass. McClure and others often blamed the dry conditions and the poor quality of the lumber for the bulk of their bridge problems. Finally, after a very long day, the convoy reached Old Fort Bridger and stayed there for the night, which the Daily Log calls a beautiful oasis. Now, I titled this slide "Fun at Fort Bridger" in large part to a practical joke that Eisenhower and his friend Sereno Brett played on an unwitting lieutenant at this particular stop. The two of them had arrived ahead of the main column and had gone into a local restaurant to have a meal, and there encountered a number of locals from the Fort Bridger area, and they enlisted their help in a little bit of fun. When the junior officers, including the ordnance observer, Lieutenant Elwell Jackson, arrived, the locals began to talk about problems with local Native Americans and the possibility that these indigenous folk might come in and attack the convoy. They were certainly glad that the convoy was there and would potentially scare them away, but were worried that the soldiers were unarmed. Ike and Sereno had borrowed a shotgun with blank shells from one of the locals and had set up a roster for sentries to protect watch the camp. They volunteered graciously to take the first shifts, and they were followed by Lieutenant Jackson. And they watched as Lieutenant Jackson stiffly marched around the camp with the old shotgun as they watched from the shadows with several other officers. At a discreet point, they started making calls from the darkness, and finally Jackson, thinking that an attack was imminent, fired the shotgun off and ran for the camp to wake people up. Eisenhower and his friend went to bed knowing that they'd played a pretty good joke. But the following morning, they realized that that might end up in the official War Department record, and so they quickly made their way to Colonel McClure to ask him to very kindly scratch that out of his report. McClure agreed, and Jackson was none the wiser that he'd been hoodwinked by his superiors. So far as my evidence has been able to say. But after their fun at Fort Bridger, they made the trip to Evanston. Now the column drove 35 miles in 7.5 hours, but it was a relatively short day for the convoy, but very brutal. Some of the hills they crossed were a 12% grade. Trucks went up one at a time, went down one at a time on creek beds and then up the following side, sometimes facing near vertical creek beds. One of the convoy's Class B machine shops, which you can see an example on the screen, broke down just short of town and had to receive a tow by the trusty Militor. They arrived in Evanston at 3 p.m. and settled down in the Uintah County Fairgrounds. Unlike some of the other towns in Wyoming, they didn't receive quite a warm welcome in Evanston. After their arrival, one of the motorcycle scouts, Sergeant Casey Browse, was actually assaulted and had to be transferred to Fort Douglas in Salt Lake City for treatment. Colonel McClure thought it best to get out of Evanston as quickly as possible before any of his soldiers sought retaliation for their injured comrade. Despite this, the convoy left Evanston at 12:30 p.m. the following day and made for the Utah line. The convoy received a much warmer welcome in Ogden and Salt Lake City. The convoy went south through some of the most brutal roads they had seen up to that point through Echo Canyon. They spent a night in Echo before heading to Ogden and later Salt Lake City. Most of what they would encounter west of Salt Lake City were across the wide, barren salt flats. When they arrived in Salt Lake, they found themselves escorted by several hundred civilian trucks, at least 2 bands, and found hundreds of local citizens lining the streets welcoming them to Utah's capital city. Following their departure from Salt Lake, that's when tragedy really struck, when they lost the Militor. It broke down several times and ended up having to be pulled back to Salt Lake City, and was not able to continue with them across the rest of their journey. That, the loss of the Militor, and the increasingly desert conditions that the convoy faced began to deteriorate both vehicles and morale. It took them several days to cross Utah, reaching Anderson's Ranch, Nevada on August 23rd. This part of the country had very few towns along the Lincoln Highway, and most of the stops in the official guidebook were actually private ranches that catered to a handful of passing travelers. This was the first time the convoy was also out of communication with the War Department or virtually anybody else, as there were no telephone or telegraph lines running through this area. The convoy itself reached Ely, Nevada on August 25th, but as they continued, mechanical problems continued to mount. The daily log continues to note the increasing number of problems due to the virtually non-existent roads and harsh terrain. 5 days later, they completed their transit of the worst parts of Nevada and arrived in Carson City to be welcomed by Governor Boyle. There, the convoy took a very much and very welcome rest day to repair their morale and repair their vehicles for arguably the hardest day yet, trekking across the Sierra Nevada mountains. Colonel McClure began the arduous climb on September 1st, and you can see from the photograph that these weren't very good roads, especially by modern standards. The heaviest vehicles took the lead in the convoy, with 100 yards spacing between each vehicle. The most experienced drivers were behind the wheel of each, and one of the passengers in each vehicle was assigned to run out and put blocks behind the wheels if that vehicle had to make an emergency stop. With help from the Nevada Highway Department, they were able to cross without encountering any traffic, as the Highway Department had blocked off eastbound travel earlier that morning. The total climb was 14 miles and took about 6 hours to complete. They encountered between 8% and 14% grades along the trip that took them up Kings Canyon and along the southern shore of Lake Tahoe. The trip wasn't without any problems. Several trucks did have mechanical failures and had to stop along the way. And one of the Trailmobile kitchen trailers actually overturned and had to be shipped to San Francisco. The convoy did make it to the California state line without any injuries, and were welcomed by a delegation from San Francisco that provided meals and entertainment. The Firestone Company had set up a movie projector showing some of the latest motion pictures, and also provided smoking cigarettes and cigars. In the report it says smokes, so we'll leave it at that. But the total crossing that particular day was 13 and a half hours, and involved 34 miles of road travel. By comparison, the next few days were much, much better. The drive out of the Sierras to Sacramento took the better part of 2 days. The roads, after the desert trails of Utah and Nevada, were the best since leaving the east. They were typically graded gravel until they reached the Californian capital, where they found the first cement roads they had seen in over a month. Their arrival in Sacramento on September 3rd was met like that in Salt Lake City, with an escort from local vehicles. They parked in the state fairgrounds and were treated that night to a dinner and cabaret, courtesy of John and Willie's from the Willie's Overland Company. The local citizens also sponsored a dance for the soldiers and officers. The final 3 days of the convoy passed very quickly. Despite some occasional mechanical issues, the convoy made good time over Californian concrete roads. Their route took them first to Stockton on September 4th, and finally Oakland on September 5th. However, fatigue was starting to show as the column reached these last several days. The Daily Log noted that soldiers' morale was high as the immediate prospect of attaining final objective was in sight. Both Stockton and Oakland welcomed the convoy with events and activities, including dances. Oakland is noted for providing both an elaborate fireworks and electrical display for the soldiers. Not quite sure what electrical display entails, but must have been something interesting. The last day of the convoy, September 6th, the convoy moved across San Francisco Bay on ferry boats, with their last drive being to Lincoln Park, where the Lincoln Highway Association presented medals to all of the soldiers present. And Colonel McClure reported to Colonel H.H. Noble, representing Lieutenant General Hunter Liggett of the Army's Western Department. At that ceremony, the Lincoln Highway Association and convoy personnel dedicated a second milestone and sort of end of the trail milestone there in Lincoln Park before the convoy parked their vehicles for the final time at the Presidio of California, or of San Francisco. Their 62-day journey was now complete, and they could begin to return home, which I believe was probably via rail, but it doesn't make that. It's important to note that this particular journey did have a long-term impact on the United States. President Eisenhower in 1956 signed the Federal Aid Highways Act that established the interstate highway system. Now, there is some debate amongst historians about the impact that his participation in the 1919 convoy and his observations later of the German Autobahn during World War II played upon his support for this bill. However, he did champion the idea of a national system of highways for both commerce and defense. That 1956 bill provided, at the time, $25 billion for the construction of 41,000 miles of highway. The interstate system would take decades to build the entire network, which was finally proclaimed complete in 1992. The last section to be built was a stretch of I-70 that included the Eisenhower Tunnel west of Glenwood Springs, Colorado. But that is a story for another time. So that brings us to the end of this particular presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes, sir.
Sorry that we came in late. When did this convoy start?
It started on July the 7th, 1919. So it went from July 7th to there at September 6th. So 62 days. They would, like I said, I calculated it out based upon the daily log, where they marked how many hours and how many miles they traveled. And the average speed over the entire convoy was about 2.8 miles per hour. To give you an idea, if we traveled that today, it would take us about, if we drove 8-hour days, it would take us a little over a week to make that same trip at 50 miles an hour. Conservatively, if we were driving less, it could probably be a full week. But it's incredible to think that it took them the better part of just over 2 months to make that kind of trek. Although it's interesting to note that if you look at the folks that were not even a century earlier traveling that same route in a covered wagon, it would take them several months to make that crossing. Or 11 days if you were talking about the Pony Express, but it was still a remarkable achievement for this period of time in these types of vehicles.
2 years.
Yes, sir.
So they were traveling basically the Lincoln Highway?
Yes, with the exception of starting in Washington, D.C. Now the Lincoln Highway, the eastern terminus was Times Square in New York City. So they did not start at the actual eastern terminus, but they traveled the majority of the Lincoln Highway. Mr. Henry Osterman, who was the official guide for the group was the field secretary for the Lincoln Highway Association had made, and this particular trip was his 19th transit across the U.S.
And that's basically Highway 30.
In most cases, yes. The only place where it's a little janky is here in Wyoming, where I-80 was built along Elk Mountain instead of following Highway 30 up through Medicine Bow, which is the bane of every traveler in the winter when it's closed for snow. Daisy, do you have any questions online?
No, but I did have a question.
All right, Daisy, what's your question?
Is there any indication or record of why the convoy met hostility where they did?
Oh, in Evanston?
Yeah.
No, there is no, we have to do a little bit more research, but we don't know why the sergeant was assaulted in Evanston or what particularly happened. Because the convoy itself received quite a bit of public acclaim throughout the state of Wyoming. It is interesting to note that many of the other communities talked about the convoy regularly in their newspapers, both in the lead up to and following the arrival, and that includes Laramie, Cheyenne, Rawlins, the Green River, but the Evanston paper only had a small article that appeared on August 4th and nothing else for the rest of the month. So I think there must have been something else at work in the community besides a lack of interest. So
In the report, does it state how many engine failures they had or anything?
So yes, but I didn't take they're so numerous, I didn't go through and, what's really neat is that the Eisenhower Presidential Library has a large collection, or has a collection of online documents and photographs, and I pulled a lot of those images for this presentation and drew upon the documents. So the daily log, Eisenhower's report, Jackson's report are all available through the Eisenhower Presidential Library for people to read, and they go into quite clear detail about the mechanical issues that they were facing along the trip, and it's pretty easy to count them as you go through. They did report them very faithfully.
For the vehicles that broke down and had to be sent to be repaired, were they towed by another military vehicle or horses?
It's a good question. In most cases, while the Militor was in operation, they were largely towing it with that, or with another truck. I think it doesn't mention that civilians assisted in any kind of vehicle recovery, but it didn't say that they didn't. So I don't know is the best answer I have.
Just thinking about that period of time, probably most people that lived outside of the communities wouldn't have had, they would have still had been relying on horses and whatever for their transportation. So it's amazing that they were able to that there were roads that they could even traverse.
Yeah, I mean, in most part, especially in Wyoming, I mean, we don't see, I need to do a little bit more research about car ownership in Wyoming to know when, large numbers of cars began to become available across the state, but it would have been definitely after the First World War. You did have road networks that did connect communities up to that point in time, but they would have been extremely primitive. The railroad was the main way for people and goods to move across the country. And you started within like the first two decades of the 20th century, you saw additional railroad trackage being laid in Wyoming to help extend. Like, for example, the Burlington Northern created a spur line to Rawlins about 1902, 1903 to help get additional folks into that part of Fremont County. So it did take a while, and even then, after cars became more prevalent, it was still decades before you'd see some of the roads paved. Togany Pass between Du Bois and Moran Junction, for example, I think was first paved sometime in the 1950s. So, yeah, Daisy, you have another question?
The prank that Eisenhower and his friend played, was that only recorded in his personal notes, or did someone else also make a recording, since it didn't apparently go to the War Department?
So, I found that in a book about the 1919 motor convoy. And so I believe it was I think the author pulled that from Eisenhower's personal diary and recollections, because it doesn't provide Jackson's point of view after being hoodwinked. Or, we'll call it what it is, he was hazed. So, well, thank you very much for coming, and hopefully the wind hasn't blown down my light in the parking lot yet.
Still up.
So, thank you very much.